ad hominem arguments, which I mount a controversial defense for.
Give us a little more for people who haven't read the book. What is an ad hominem argument?
Ad hominem argument is attacking the person, not the argument. When you're in high school debate, and my daughter's in high school debate, you are taught play the bull, not the man. And that's great in theory, great on college campuses. In real life, we all know you have to play the man and the bull, right? That is just, and I make the point because one of the main ways you win an argument is by asserting your credibility and diminishing your opponents. Aristotle called it ethos, one of the 3 pillars of an argument. And therefore, when people say, well, you should just leave the person alone, just address the argument, that's nonsense. And I give examples in the book. If somebody has a history of lying, you should point that out. You don't trust that person. That's an ad hominem argument. If somebody is paid by the fossil fuel industry to deny climate change, you should point that out, that there's a conflict of interest there, and so on. And then the third section is what I call, what some people might call, WBD. It's kind of worthy but dull. It's practice, preparation, how to build confidence. You're like, oh, that stuff. Oh, that sounds like homework. There's actually a chapter on homework. But it's probably the most important third of the book, because I couldn't do what I do and you wouldn't be able to do what you do unless you put in those hours and that effort. Because, as I say, this is not natural stuff. This is stuff that requires preparation, delivery. And I tell the story of many people in the book who we consider today to be great orators who didn't start out that way, whether it was Winston Churchill, whether it was, I talk about Demosthenes. Those of you who studied the ancient period, Demosthenes was the greatest orator of ancient Greece. He's considered by some to be the father of rhetoric. Demosthenes could not give a speech in his 20s. He embarrassed himself in public in court. He had a stutter and a stammer. He was short of breath. He built himself an underground Batman-style cave, which he retreated into. He even shaved off half his head, so he would be too embarrassed to come out of the cave. So he forced himself to stay down there, standing in front of a mirror, running back and forth, with pebbles in his mouth to get past his stammer, until he thought he was good enough to go out and take people on again. And today he's considered one of the great fathers of rhetoric. So I'd say, if he can do it, if Churchill could do it, if MLK can do it.
And where did Churchill practice?
Churchill, there's a story about his valet, Norman, who used to hear Churchill murmuring in the bathroom, in the tub, and he would run and say, "Sir, what can I get you?" And he would say, "Norman, I'm not talking to you. I'm addressing the House of Commons." Churchill would practice his speeches in the tub, because Churchill, I tell the story in the book, when he was a younger MP, tried to give a speech in the Commons, lost his place, went red-faced. I'm sure many of us have been there, just couldn't remember what was the next thing they wanted to say. And he got, if you watch the House of Commons, it's not like the House of Representatives. It's much more furious, Prime Minister's questions.
A little spicier.
A little spicier, belligerent, and he got heckled down. He was so embarrassed. He said, "That will never happen to me again." So he spent the next 20, 30 years becoming the guy we now remember, fight them on the beaches, stand up to the Nazis. That didn't come naturally to him.
So give us a little sense of each stage. So you have a big interview coming up this Sunday. Maybe you do. I don't know what it is. You could tell us all here. What are you doing to prepare for that starting tomorrow?
So the number one thing I do when I have an interview guest, and I encourage, and this doesn't just apply to interviews, this applies to, you have a big meeting in the boardroom tomorrow. You have a big case in court if you're a lawyer. You have a big presentation in high school. I try and find out it sounds obvious. I know it sounds like the Department of Bleeding obvious. Try and find out everything there is you could possibly find out about the issue, the other person, every argument. I talk about in the book a technique called steel manning. We always talk about straw manning, using the weakest possible argument against your opponent, misrepresenting your opponent's argument in a weak way. Don't do that. I mean, you could do that during a debate to mock them, but when you're preparing for a debate, steel man the argument. Come up with the strongest possible argument on the other side that you're going to come up against. I always try and pride myself in knowing the other side's argument better than they do. If you can know the other person's argument better than they do, then they've got really nowhere else to go, and there's no surprises. You don't want to be surprised in a live event, on live TV, in the middle of a boardroom presentation. So people, again, take this stuff for granted, but it requires a lot of time. I talk about in the book about role-playing. When I was at Al Jazeera English, when we spent a long time on interviews, longer than we have in cable news, as you'll discover in a couple of weeks. We would actually sit and role-play. So, you know, we had the former Israeli foreign minister on the show, Danny Ayalon. I had a producer basically become Danny Ayalon for a week. And she would come into meetings and she would be Danny Ayalon. And I would treat her as Danny Ayalon. And she would, basically her job was to go through all of his previous interviews and know what his answers are to various questions. It was almost like a chart. If he says this, I'll say this. If he says this, I'll go there. So that you're complete, the whole thing is mapped out before. People are thinking, oh, look at Mehdi just winging it. How did he pull that? I wish I could take credit and say I just pulled it out from my memory. No, it's all planned out. Like I'm calling her Danny even after the show's over because I got so into it. But, you know, the role playing, brainstorming, brainstorming, steel manning. I talk about all these techniques to get ready for that big event. Do the homework, put in the time, because it really annoys me as someone who does this for a living that people go out there and think, well, you know, if I'm going to operate on a patient, or if I'm going to do somebody's tax plans, I'm an accountant, I'm going to do all the work for, I'm going to go to the poshest universities, I'm going to get the best degrees. Public speaking, oh yeah, I can just do that in half an hour. No, put the same amount of effort in. It's just as hard, if not harder. About it in the book, a way to kind of disarm your opponent is present them with their own words without telling them they're their words. People think that's below the belt. Why is it below the belt? It's your words. It's not my job to remember that they're your words. It's your job. So we read out the quote. I said, well, he spent the whole show saying, Iran, we must, but, you know, hawkish position. I said, do you agree with people who say that Iran's nuclear program is not No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. But those are your words. Those are moments. You know, some people, they go cheer at football games. That's me. That's my moment. Yes. That's my moment. I say the receipts. And I have a chapter on chapter 3 of the book is all about the receipts. So always make sure you have your receipts. Don't get into any debate, argument, discussion where you are not armed with receipts. And sometimes physical receipts. The whole phrase receipts, Whitney Houston's line about receipts, comes from actually wanting to see physical receipts. Sometimes it's great to have a document. You've done that. Again, in the briefing room, you've pulled out. I've got it here.
I had this in my pocket. I just
accidentally. Just accidentally. You didn't know.
There you are. So one of the things you talk about in the book, which really stuck with me, is just this: where do you balance between facts and charts and heart and emotion?
You have to have an emotional appeal. You have to be able to tell stories, engage people with passion. If it's going to be heart versus head, the heart is going to beat the head 9 times out of 10. And again, goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle talks about logos, reason. He talks about ethos, your personal credibility, but he talks about pathos. He talks about the need to connect with people's hearts. The human brain is not hardwired to receive a bunch of statistics. That's not how you convince your spouse or your kids to get anything done. You make an emotional appeal. But when we get into public policy and politics, sometimes we just think, I think Democrats in particular, because I don't know, liberal arts education, law degrees, no idea. But it's this idea of, we're like, yeah, rational. We will rationally defeat you in this Socratic method. And unfortunately, that's not how Americans are or most people around the world are. They want to be inspired, enthused. They want to see righteous anger. Number one, you pick your battles, Jen. You don't try and rebut everything. That's a fool's errand. You pick the weakest, dumbest, most ridiculous claim, and you zero in on that and you mock the hell out of that. So that the audience says, wow, that's a load of nonsense. Surely the rest of those arguments you put are probably nonsense as well. Number two, you don't budge. In our industry, and I can say our industry.
I've been there 6 months. I'm in.
You're in. Too many interviewers, and I've said this openly, move on too quickly, and it's not always their fault. We live in a very time-poor environment. You're gonna have the go to break very soon. You know, there's always an ad break coming up. It's a lot of, you know, not enough time on cable TV, and we move on. And the gish galloper, the bullshitter, takes advantage of that because they know that they can say 10 nonsensical things, and you either will rebut one of them or you won't rebut. You'll just move on to your next question because your producer's like, come on, keep the interview moving. My position is don't budge. Less is more. Don't do 20 questions. Do 2. But make sure they answer those 2. So when I interviewed Steve Rogers in 2018, who was a Trump advisor, sadly not Captain America, for my Al Jazeera English show, sadly as a Marvel fan.
It could still happen.
My team and I decided that we're going to focus on one Trump claim, which was, at the time he was saying, U.S. Steel has announced 6 new steel mills. And they hadn't announced 6 new, not at all. They put out a statement saying we haven't announced it, but Trump knew no one's going to ask him, no one's going to fact check. He's already moved on to the next lie. So I said to his proxy, Trump didn't announce 6 steel new mills. That's false. That's a lie. Oh, no. What he meant to say was, steel is doing really well. I said, yeah, but that's not what he said. He said a very specific number. He said 6 steel mills. Where are they? U.S. Steel says there aren't any. Oh, well, manufacturing's doing so. And he just kept dodging, and I wouldn't move on. And I kept saying, but 6. Where are the 6 steel mills? He said 6. He's lying, isn't he? At one point, Steve Rogers says to me, and you can watch the clip, it's my pinned tweet. It's a bit of fun. He says, just move on. Literally, because he had never done, because he started producing me. Just move on.
Your 15 minutes are up, sir.
John Bolton style. I said, no, I'm not going to move on. And this is the third point. This is what I said. I said, because you know it's a lie, and that's what you're doing here. The third point is call it out. When someone is trying to BS you, forget about all the other arguments in the book and just say, you know what? This isn't a good faith argument. This is BS. Right? Call out the strategy. This is a gish gallop. This is nonsense. You are trying to flood
Don't
the
say
zone.
Gish Gallop.
Don't say Gish Gallop. Unless you've read the book and you're talking to someone else who's read the book, which I'm sure you have. Unless we divide up after and we will argue. But pointing out, and the Rand Corporation makes another analogy. The Rand Corporation talks about Putin, who's a master of this also. If you saw his recent speech where he rambled through everything from Ukraine to communism to transgender rights. Rand Corporation says when the Russian fire hose of falsehood is on, the fire hose of falsehood, put raincoats on the people it's aimed at. Well, your job is, if somebody is BSing everyone, is to protect the audience. You want to tell them, you want to make them aware of what's going on. So that is, I mean, look, it's not easy to go up against a Gish Gallop, but there's a reason why only people like Jonathan Swan have done a good job of actually interviewing Trump, and I talk about Swan's interview. But it's hard, and there's no silver bullet.